Good morning, Connecting Point Church family. It is Friday morning, which means, once again, I have an opportunity to share in some devotional thoughts based on our passages that we read this morning from our Following Jesus Bible reading plan out of the YouVersion Bible app. There's a couple things that I think stood out to me in our reading, specifically out of Second Timothy. So, if we're thinking about Second Timothy, it was written by Paul, a letter to Timothy, this younger man, and by young, we're not talking like 15. He was definitely an adult, but just a younger individual who is a leader in the church. And he's kind of just giving him advice in leadership and in life. And in today's passage, we read 2 Timothy chapter 3. And there were, there were two pieces that stuck out to me, and we'll go with the second one first, because of its consistency with other conversations we've been having lately. And so 2 Timothy 3, verse 12 says, "In fact, everyone who wants to live a godly life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted." And I thought about that, and I mean, we heard in Peter about the reality of suffering and of persecution. We heard in Paul, in Philippians, about the reality of suffering and the role that it plays in our lives. And here we are again now in this letter to Timothy, this advice that Paul is giving to this leader, and he is just reminding him, right? I mean, this letter is closing out. We're a chapter away from this letter closing out, and Paul is just reminding him that, hey, everyone who wants to live a godly life, just take heart, because you will be persecuted. Those who decide to live this way will be persecuted. And so, I don't know, I guess I just heard that, and I hear that, and I am encouraged, because in the midst of persecution, we can know that we are exactly where we ought to be. In the midst of suffering, we're exactly where we ought to be, as this is kind of just part of life for a Christian. And I think there's going to be some more on this after I talk about the first part of the two things that stood out to me. So now that the first part that stood out to me was this this piece right at the beginning of chapter 3, where he talks about the terrible times in the last days. And as I read it, I got kind of like a verse into it, and I wrote in the margins, "Is this us today?" And then I read a couple more verses, and by the end I said, "Yes, exclamation point, us today, Lord, help us." And it's not that I am like making this prophetic statement that we are in fact in the last days, meaning like any day now Jesus is going to return. Any day now Jesus could return. But I do believe that we are living in the last days, in the sense that when I think about it, the last days are just those days before Christ's return. And in these days, there's going to be some junk that happens. And the junk that Paul outlines here, when I have stopped watching the news. I'll be honest with you. I have stopped watching the news because, honestly, it's just so disappointing and so heartbreaking. I mean, we live in a world that is so selfish. And it's not just one side or the other. I think it would be easy to be like, yeah, well, they are selfish. And the truth is, it's not one side or the other. The world is super selfish, and the world is so absent of love. Those were kind of like the two things that stood out to me. So he goes through, he says, people will be lovers of themselves. So I guess they have love just for themselves, although I would even debate that people even love themselves right now with the junk that they're deciding to do. Lovers of money, boastful, proud, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, without love, unforgiving, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not lovers of the good, treacherous, conceited, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God. And I read that and I'm like, man, that is the world that we are living in. That's the world that we've been living in, and it just keeps going and going and going and going and getting worse and worse and worse. And it is just the world that we live in. And man, that is heartbreaking. And so I read that initially and I was like, man, that's totally where we live, and that's totally the world that surrounds us. But then I got kind of checked, and I wondered maybe if there's something more being said here, because the final statement that he says in verse 5 is having a form of godliness, but denying its power. So people have the form of godliness, but deny its power. And they do all these other things. And Paul warns to have nothing to do with such people. So Paul's not just talking, I don't believe at least, Paul is not just talking about the outside world. Paul is talking about the world that is to be found within the church. And I don't know that we're necessarily here in its fullness. I wouldn't say that everybody's this way. But at the same time, when I think about it and think about some of the statistics of crime, of divorce, of marital unfaithfulness, of misuse and misappropriation of money, the reality is the likelihood of those things occurring within the church are equal to the likelihood of those things occurring outside of the church. And so while we might look at this and say, well, I don't know anybody who's done that, and nobody at our church does that, and probably not, maybe not, probably not. The sad truth is, from a statistical standpoint, this stuff exists within the church just as much as it exists outside of the church, and that is heartbreaking. That is heartbreaking. And I believe that God is calling us to something more, something deeper, something bigger, something more real than the life that we are living outside of the church and even within the church. This idea of having a form of godliness but denying its power, in my mind, doesn't just describe, but it lodges like the ultimate accusation against these people, right? These accusations of lovers of money, boastful, proud, abusive, disobedient of their parents, ungrateful, unholy, without love, unforgiving, slanderous, without self-control. Like these are accusations that are essentially being lodged against the world and even possibly the church. And the biggest one, the most serious one, is that they have the form of godliness, but they deny its power. And I just wonder, is this where we, the church today, are? Do we have the form of godliness, but simply deny God's power in us, through us, and among us? I think it's clear that God is at work in the world around us, that God is even at work in the lives of individuals. But I don't read stories that are happening today like what happened in the early chapters of Acts. I don't read stories that are happening today within America, within Turlock, within California, however you want to frame it, that are of stories of things that are happening like mass healings and major life transformations, and then demonstrations of those realities. We just don't see that. And I can't help but wonder, do we not see those things because we have a form of godliness, but we are simply and tragically denying its power? We are denying its power in our own lives because we are continuing to allow ourselves to be kind of sucked into this life of, or this thought of like, we are broken people, we are human. And so we use it as an excuse to not live up to the full potential that we have been called to live up to. Is this why, or is this how we are denying the power of God? And is this why we are not seeing these Acts type stories take place? Maybe. You see, guys, as I read this, as I reflected on it, as I prayed about it, as I journaled about it, I came to a place where I don't want to have the form of godliness in my life. I don't want just like this shell or this shape or this facade of godliness. I want the power of God in me and through me. As Paul said, I think it is in Philippians, I want to know Christ and the power of his resurrection and the participation in his sufferings. This is what I want to know in my life. This is what I want to experience. I don't want anybody to ever look at me and say, man, there's a godly man right there. I want people to look at me and simply see Jesus living among them. I don't want excuses in my life anymore of me simply being human or me being a broken person. We are all broken people. Yes, I get it, but it is in our brokenness that he can be made strong. And so we have got to allow him to be made strong. We have got to stop denying his power in the midst of our brokenness so that way we can truly be transformed into the people that he has created us to be. Yes, he's called us to be this, but he has created us to be this. Church, it is time that we begin to live into our full potential as sons and daughters of our Heavenly Father. No more facades. No more forms of godliness, but true righteousness. This is the life that we need. This is the life that the church needs. This is the life that the world needs. Perhaps as we're now only a couple of weeks away from an election, rather than being so concerned with the candidate that our country needs, we ought to be a whole lot more concerned with the person of Jesus that we all need. Guys, we just spend so much effort and energy and resources trying to elevate particular people or a particular political way of life or a particular athletic team. And those things just don't matter. They don't matter. Because, in all seriousness, regardless of who the president of the United States is, if Jesus got a hold of that person, we don't have anything to worry about. Regardless of who is in the House or the Senate, If Jesus got a hold of those people, we don't got anything to worry about. But this isn't an outward looking thing. This verse, I read it and I don't make accusations of others. I simply feel an accusation against me of, if God got a hold of me wholly and completely through and through, I wouldn't have anything to worry about with respect to the terrible times of these last days, or just simply having the form of godliness. As Pastor Greg has talked about, as Hal Perkins talked about, let's take care of this relationship first. Let's make sure that we're where we ought to be so we can be who we need to be in the world around us. Well, I look forward to seeing you guys in a couple days. Sunday morning, bright and early. One more time here in the outdoor worship center. Hope you guys enjoy the rest of your Friday, that you have a great Saturday, and we'll see you Sunday. Peace out.